Minnow Gijagad on pay to wash day. Buju and Dinaway Maganadog, Misty Wilkie and Dijnakas, Makwa and Dudam, Mikanakwa Ju and Dunjaba, and Mikwich Bizandawiye. Hello, my relatives. My English name is Misty Wilkie. I'm Bear Clan. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians located in North Dakota. And on behalf of the University of Minnesota School of Nursing Center for Indigenous People Health and Nursing, I want to welcome you to the first in a series of amazing speakers we have lined up for Native American Heritage Month. I invite you to use this month to fully engage and commit to learning about Native history, health, and people. There will be a variety of events and activities in your communities, and I encourage you to attend one or several. They are typically open to the public, and you can always find someone to talk to if you have questions. One of the things about Native people is we love teaching and sharing about our culture because it's something that we have fought for centuries to keep alive. And so for those that are interested in learning about it, we are more than happy to share. A couple of housekeeping items. When Brandon is done with his presentation, we will open it up for Q&A. And at that point, we will stop recording. And so to ask a question, if you could use the feature on Zoom to raise your hand, I will acknowledge you by stating your name, and then your audio and video will be enabled for you to ask your question. So with that, I'd like to introduce Brandon Alkire. His Dakota name is Lame Deer, and he is a citizen of the Standing Rock Sioux Nation. He was raised by his grandmother on the Standing Rock Sioux Oyate and was taught to walk the traditional path of Dakota medicine men. He is a Navy veteran and has his law degree amongst many other talents and areas of expertise. So I am just so thrilled that Brandon is our first speaker in this series to really set the tone of what it means to be Native American in the US and what sets us apart from other ethnic and minority groups within this country. So with that, I want to say thank you, Brandon, for agreeing to be with us today and sharing your time. So I am going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilkie, and I'm so honored to be here today. Thank you for those that are attending. I'm going to start sharing my presentation. So give me a moment. So again, welcome everybody. Today's presentation is on Native American political status. My name is Brandon, as Dr. Wilkie said. It's a really complex topic, but it's so necessary in the next evolution of how to engage with tribal nations. So thank you again, everybody, for attending. So as Dr. Wilkie said, it's Native American Heritage Month. So happy Native American Heritage Month. This is the kickoff to that. Although for my friends and colleagues that are online today, we're happy to be Native American every day. So this is a really good way to start that conversation and highlighting really what it means to be a political status. I want to caveat this presentation today because what we're talking about is really complex. Thus the picture of the skipping stone. We're going to touch the surface primarily. We will not have time to go way deeper. Just keep in mind that any of these topic discussion, topic issues, topic points could go into a dissertation level conversation. So, but today, for purposes of time, we're going to just skip the stone across. There are many facets and nuances to everything that's being presented today. So what I'm showing today as examples are going to be something that as a way to highlight political status rather than a an exhaustive list of what political status is. So it's more of the example as a nuance and a facet of it. But I think it'll really highlight what and how it is applied. So, like I said, there's a limited scope. And I always put this on the forefront is that tribal nations are unique and distinct. There's 574 of them federally recognized. So what applies for certain tribes is not necessarily going to apply for others. So the diversity is rich, which makes the topic very, very complex. So again, that is my caveat. The theme for us today is think like a nation, not a reservation. There's 11 tribal nations here in Minnesota, which is where I'm calling in from. And each has its own distinct government, its own distinct culture, its own distinct way of doing things and cultural practices. Even though we tend to mark them into two different groups, which is Dakota and Anishinaabe. Even within the subset of those larger groupings, Upper Sioux is not going to have the same practices as Prairie Island. So it's a really good way to start to wrap your head around this concept. So for today's presentation, we just did the introduction. I'm going to start with why treaties matter. That is going to be, again, that is one of those really complex topics. I'm only going to touch on some of the high points of that. Go into what is political status. Show you the difference between using race versus political status. And then talk about a DE&I paradox that exists because of it. Go through some of the impacts of not using political status in our everyday actions, and then show you some of the highlights we're doing here in Minnesota. We are very proud, and we need to be proud of some of the efforts we're doing in Minnesota because we're trailblazing a place that most of the country hasn't even seen yet. So I'm very proud of our state. And then, of course, my contact information and questions will be shared at the end. So why do treaties matter? This is an initiative housed here at the Minnesota, and back up, I'm with the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council. I'm their legislative director. Within the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council, we have an initiative called Why Treaties Matter. This is one of the pictures from that. It's all about self-government in Dakota and Ojibwe nations. Keep in mind, Ojibwe and Anishinaabe are interchangeable. And so Dakota and Anishinaabe nations and treaties. For those of my friends that online that are not foreign policy experts, a treaty is a formal agreement between sovereigns. For here in the United States and for tribal nations, once a treaty is signed and ratified by Congress, they're considered to be the supreme law of the land. So tribal nations understand that treaties are living documents. They really do highlight those protections within our own state government and within the federal government of provisions that were agreed upon. So one of the biggest provisions is reserving our cultural rights. And how Native Americans see it is reserving our relationship rights to both the land and the relatives that live around us. Treaties have acted like a legal wall that has protected the culture, language, and jurisdiction. We know that that's not always the case. There's many examples of where that wall had crumbled. Boarding school, for example, which is why I'm wearing orange today in recognition of boarding schools. But for the most part, they are still existing. They are still good law, and they still protect many of our sovereign rights. Treaties also recognize that tribal sovereignty is inherent and not given. So at the time of negotiation, it wasn't about bestowing treaty rights to tribes, it was about preserving them. So we can go a little bit more into that. Tribal nations, a little bit of history with how treaties were formed. And I put this under because I think this is a really key point when looking at the rest of the presentation. Tribal nations conveyed sovereign status to newly formed nation, the United States. At the time of 13 colonies and the breakaway from England, the 13 colonies were trying to establish sovereignty. The European nations were not recognizing that sovereignty. Instead, were like still considering them part of England or a colony of England. So what the newly formed colonies did was turn around, practiced treaty making with the tribal nations who were already here with established governments and citizenry and practices, as a way to exercise sovereignty, to show the other countries that we have a sovereign ability as a nation. So it's really kind of fun when you look at it from another angle of why treaty engagement occurred. Early tribal nations, and this is somewhat true today, had really no interest or desire to be part of the Great Experiment. Rather, they were trying to keep colonists on one side while they stood on the other. And so because they were trying to preserve their way of life. So that still holds true in many ways today. This is why you see cultural practices existing after, several hundred years. So there was a bargain for exchange that really, and we'll go more into the bargain for exchange, but there was a bargain for exchange that occurred that really codified that into a treaty. So the most important part of treaties, is that all United States citizens benefit from the tribal federal treaties. The land you're standing on right now was part of a treaty, any part of the United States. So just keep that in mind as we talk today. So what is a political status? I really like Professor Fletcher's restatement of the political status. It comes from a court case, which really brought it to the forefront and allowed for a deeper conversation around it in a famous court case, Supreme Court case called Morton v. Mancari. But as Professor Fletcher says, it's the underlying theory for political status classification is really highlighting that relationship between the United States and tribal nations. This relationship established through treaty is inherently political, meaning two sovereigns coming together in a mutual understanding. So these are arising out of the treaties later in legislation because they were codified, and then recognizing that this inherent sovereignty existed before first contact. So today we talk about it as a trust relationship for a multitude of reasons, which I'm not going to go into here today. That could be a future conversation. But just know that under the trust relationship is really the way that we talk about these two groups, these two sovereigns, how they interact with each other. And this is born from the treaties themselves. So in that trust relationship, there are many federal obligations that were part of the bargain for exchange. Again, for my friends that are not part of the foreign, that are not part of foreign policy making, this might sound a little bit weird, but I like to think of it as a contract. And contracts are very easy to wrap our heads around. But with a contract, a party over here, in this case, the United States, wanted to expand their sovereignty and jurisdiction. The tribal nations over here were holding the land that the United States wanted. They came together, the United States, how do we get the land that you're on? Or how do we help expand our sovereign and influence? And the tribe said, sure, not necessarily in that very happy manner. Many times it was coerced, but that's another story. Came together and said, we want to preserve our borders then, if you agree to stay here. And there's a whole scholarship on how the expansion occurred, but just know that tribal nations agreed to exchange the land for various provisions and then a preservation of their culture and way of life. Again, duly noted here, all inherent rights were preserved, not bestowed. So I know we like to hear in history that when treaties or when the government engaged with tribes with treaty making, all these rights were bestowed upon the tribes as recognition, as all these other pieces. That is simply not true. We just preserved the rights we currently had, inherent rights. And again, Native Americans didn't want to be part of the experiment. They really just wanted to be left alone. And so that really does show up in a couple of different areas, even in today's world. A treaty then is a recognition of a sovereign to sovereign relationship. So how tribes view it is in this current era is of self-determination. And self-determination has many aspects to it. A couple of them are tribal nations have the ability to choose their own citizens. They also have jurisdiction and regulatory authority. But for the conversation today of political status, it's this conversation around citizenry within a tribal nation. So I like to refocus the lens when we're talking about this because people don't, many people that I'm finding are not understanding how this works with tribal nations in the United States. So I always ask them this question, these few questions. Can Italy determine the citizenship for Japan? Does Ireland only grant citizenry to people who have predetermined phenotypes, i.e., eye color, hair color, skin color? Does the United States? We know that we have no national culture here, and we know that we have no national language. We're a melting pot, like we like to say. And so when you look at it through this lens of country-based citizenry, this is the same level as tribal nations. So with that refocused lens, stepping into the presentation, the United States, unfortunately, is under a racial obsession. I mean, this started as a form to classify humans, divide and exclude. I want to say this is historic. We know that this is not, especially in the current political climate. So divide and exclude still exists today. It just takes on different forms, but that's the purpose of most racial classifications. Resource allocation, huge, which is why even today we see different racial groups fighting over one pot of money because I mean, it's kind of nefarious how that exists, but that is one of the purposes of using race as a classification. Promoting a capitalistic hierarchy. We've seen this both historically and currently, contemporary. And this is where we saw the land being allocated. There's a whole history behind all of that. And then, of course, the civil rights movement, then we're looking for racial equality. The problem, though, the problem with using with United States' racial obsession is that Native Americans don't fit into any of these categories. We are hurt by all of the elements of this racial obsession, but we don't fit in when it comes to any of our equal opportunity efforts. So it brings us to the diversity, equity, and inclusion paradox. Because Native Americans are not racial and political status, again, citizenry versus race, and we'll go into that in a second, we don't fit into the principles of DE&I, which is really born from the civil rights movement and looking at racial equity. Don't get me wrong, we still fit into the category when we're looking at ourselves as race, but the issue with viewing it through a racial lens is that it removes the history, it removes the jurisdiction, it removes the treaties, and all these other really amazing components that make up a Native American identity. So race versus a political status. Race and political status are not mutually exclusive. You can be one and the other, but for purposes of the conversation today, I'm going to pull them apart so we can look at them for what they are. Native Americans do fit into both categories. However, with the political status piece, that is primarily exclusive to Native American people. So for race, and I have a background in sociology, so I'm taking the sociological view of a race, which is a social construct for human classification. Understand that there's no scientific basis for this, meaning that if I, God forbid, needed to get a blood transfusion, I don't have to wait for another Native American like Dr. Wilkie to donate blood for me. I can go into any hospital and they can pull from their blood resources as long as it matches my blood type, and I can get an infusion. So that alone right there is like the basis for why this is not a science. That's one example of why this is not a scientific basis. Secondly, I know a lot of my friends and coworkers around here do the 23andMe as a way to almost justify or would give credence to using DNA as a way, as a justification for racial classification. But when you understand how those things like 23andMe work, they're meant for entertainment, one, but two, they go into certain regions, take sample sizes, and analyze it of all the commonalities. And if you happen to share commonalities with anyone in that region, then they immediately send you there saying you're part of this. And so that is still not a classification on a scientific basis. That's meant for entertainment. Race, because it's a construct, then is really phenotypically driven, meaning if your hair color, hair texture, skin color, eye color, or facial features match somebody else within your geographical location, then you must be one group. And we know this is, it also, well, let me back up. They also incorporate a lot of the bigger commonalities too, like geographic, regional pieces, shared ethnicities, beliefs and ideologies, i.e. culture, and then a shared language, all of which, again, there's no science behind saying we're something different. Political status, on the other hand, is citizenry driven, meaning we share political ideologies, we can share all the components of race, but we are operated as we're operational government. So it's derived from this government to government relationship, from treaty making, from constitutions, from case law. Case law, I've held it several times. I just referenced Martin v. Mancari. It's more about the citizenry than the race. So the Venn diagram here is, I'm very visual, so I have to see exactly how everything interconnects visually. And this is a really good way to highlight what being Native American is. So looking at it as a federal citizen, we're all federal citizens, we're citizens of the United States. I'm from Minnesota, so I'm also a citizen in Minnesota, but I'm also from Standing Rock. And so Standing Rock is in North Dakota, but the tribe itself sits outside those. It sits within the boundaries of North Dakota. It shares geography with North Dakota, but I'm also a citizen there. So the applicable authorities that exist are under the United States Constitution. We all enjoy the privileges and protections of the Constitution that is uniform across the board. We also, for us in Minnesota, share the Minnesota privileges and protections of our state constitution. Again, this is all very surface level. We could go way deeper into some of the history that has really blocked many of those efforts into why Dakota people have such a unique status here in Minnesota. And then the one that's generally forgotten, sadly, from both the federal and state system is this tribal constitution citizenry and all the privileges and protections of that. And don't get me wrong, there are protections and privileges that come along with it, even though people tend to look at it as an extra set of rights. It's not true. It's because we're political and we paid for those privileges and protections through land cessation. Again, the benefit piece, you benefit from the land that we bargained for and exchanged for the right to have our way of life, our culture, and many of those other components. So the impact is really the meat and potatoes of today's presentation. So political status derived from those authorities that I just spoke of, derived from treaties, derived from constitutions. We are in, the Native American population is in the Native US Constitution. Political status, when not recognizing it, has many, many impacts. Again, for purposes of today, I chose to highlight two, but two really, really big ones in my opinion, as they seem to impact a lot of facets within Minnesota society, but nationally too in US society. These are not mutually exclusive. Other people will differ from my opinion of having omission or discrimination as part of one of those pervasive components to not adhering to political status. But for today's purpose and presentation, these are the two that I chose. So omission, and again, in the purposes of time, I chose to talk about data and data practices. And this is one of those crucial components that really rears itself in almost everyday society. In my work especially, it rears its head. Representation. We think that that's like this ethereal piece, but it really does have a crucial role to play when looking at the preservation of treaty rights, when it looks at doing some other very important work that we're working on, and I can go into that in a second. I want to highlight that representation in college admission is one of my personal pieces. I know that's with Dr. Wilkie as well. That's really driving her work to get more Native nurses into PhD programs and get them into community to teach. So it's phenomenal the work she's doing, but the fact that she had to do it is part of the conversation. Hiring practices. We're here at the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council, but we don't see ourselves in other components of the state, and there's a multitude of reasons why, but I wanted to put that one on, raise that one up for part of the conversation. And then discrimination. These are, so community-based organizations is one of the weird pieces that I've heard several times throughout my career, referencing how tribal nations operate. There's a really, really sad understanding of tribal nations and people, because we're racially obsessed within the United States, we can only see it through the racial lens, and how we process it in our head is thinking of them as like this community-based organization. So it really, it has a lot of nefarious actions that come from it, because when referencing it like that, it diminishes both the tribal governments and actually the citizenry themselves. We're working here at the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council on a disparity report to really bring forth and raise up some of those really big problem areas that we want to address both legislatively and then with tribal nations. We're also finding that there's a lot of willful ignoring of political status, even when trainings like this are offered. People choose not to really accept, or even, you don't have to accept everything I'm saying today, but it should spark a curiosity. And that's the whole goal here, is like, what is this? How do I incorporate this into the work I do, or how I engage with tribal nations around me? There's a really famous senator from Minnesota that used to say, we all do better when we all do better. And so that curiosity, that sense of community is what I'm hoping will spark today. A lot of the willfully ignoring political status has led to some workplace harassment and discrimination. And I'm going to talk about that in a bit. Misrepresentation. This is a really big topic, but it has such a nefarious and very pervasive impact within um, Minnesota state, but also within how tribal nations and Native American people engage um, with both academics and with there's a lot of facets to misrepresentation. I'll talk about that in a minute. Understand that omission can lead to discrimination. And so when you have data omission, and what I mean by data omission is that when and I'll go into this in a second, but when we talk about tiny subsets, it really does green light many of these other pieces on the discrimination side. So these two are interlocked and rear themselves quite frequently. So data omission. Again, small population size, sample sizes. This is a statement that I've heard time and time again, even just literally a week ago when I was asking for some data on court hearings, I was told that because they know that Native Americans interact with the judicial system at a higher rate than most, but the data that they have for them because of the large quantity of people coming through the door is deemed data insignificant. And again, because they're using a racial component to track that data. So it's really, it has a lot of implications and I'll talk about what the impact of that can be. Lack of understanding is a huge one when talking about data, and who owns data is another really big issue. And many people are unclear of how to account for political status. We're having a deeper conversation with a federal agency right now on putting forth some of ways on how to track tribal citizenry. And so it's a fun conversation, but in its current state, we're still considered race. So the impact of data omission, what we're finding through our disparity report is that Native American disparities, when we're not included in the data conversations, really let these disparities continue and grow. There's also this concept I'm putting forth is disparity profiteering. And what that means is that we're tracking like health data, for example. I'm going to pull one component out of it, which would be diabetes. We have one of the highest highest numbers within the within diabetes classification. And when you look at it from a 20-year projection, that is an upward slope. Money every year gets poured into that using the data from Native Americans because the data is so profound that generally anyone that puts it forth to do the diabetes work will get approved. Not all, but most. And yet that money goes into more of like the learning and the awareness campaigns, but we're not seeing the number going down. Meanwhile, the money that comes in also goes into creating more jobs to talk about the diabetes awareness and not actually addressing the problem itself. So there's a lot of, in my opinion, there's profiteering that happens because there's no understanding of how to address it from a cultural perspective. Representation, because of the small sample size, data insignificance, we get omitted many times from the conversation. I heard this when I was working at the courts. I would bring this up about how do we address some of these bigger disparities with like domestic violence. And I was told that we need to pour our money into efforts that'll give us more bang for the dollar. Meaning that Native American population is too tiny to really produce the type of results we're looking for. Meanwhile, domestic violence within Native American communities continues to go on that upward slope. So it is really another profiteering piece without actually addressing the issue. We're not allowed to be part of the calculus when looking at some of the bigger conversations around disparities because of our tiny population size. All of these, again, are also looking at it through a race lens. So that's a caveat here as well. When we're omitted, it also omits our societal knowledge on how to build partnerships with tribal nations. And so it really hinders how that we can all do better, right? Senator Wellstone, we all do better when we all do better. When you let a group of people just fall by the wayside without investing into their community to meet the needs that they have, that's not a partnership. And so we see a lot of bad ramifications that come from that for all of us. It removes history, damages trust, and greenlights the discrimination, because when you're a tiny population, you're vulnerable to people's bad actions. And so, again, this is another effort we're working on, doing a presentation later on in the month with EEOC to have this conversation. Removes access to funding schemes, and even worse, it justifies funding at reallocation. So these are just some of the broad overview. This list is not exhaustive. Again, this is literally touching the surface. In representation, when we omit people from the representation component, we're also looking at no consultation, even though you're dealing with a community that really probably needs to be consulted with when addressing issues that affect them. So that's part of the, I mean, keep in mind, this is really complex and really nuanced, but those are like some of the crucial impacts that and generally happen, and these are intertwined. So what we found before here in Minnesota, before we passed and codified our statutes, was that tribal nations were included, but after the fact, after the solutions were created, after legislation was being introduced, then they would go to tribal nations and said, oh yeah, by the way, we're doing this. And then misrepresentation again. You're going to find in this presentation is that because these are so intertwined, the impacts are going to be all really very closely aligned, if not the same. So keep that in mind as well. But with representation, there you see again, not owning our story, Native American disparities grow. This one I put in here because I wanted to really highlight this, and I've had several conversations with some of the academic institutions, but non-Native citizens publishing on our experience. And there's a whole host of issues here. I know there's a lot of effort to work on like a uniform IRB, for example. But this has been an issue going on within academic institutions for some time. So, and it still happens today. The impacts of that then are incorrectly formulating public policy, not looking at us as looking at us through a racial lens, which then allows for a broad brushstroke when creating policy or other. And then it removes those histories. And it keeps those massive gaps in our societal knowledge because we're not telling our story the way it needs to be told. It hurts our partnership development, damages trust, and greenlights that discrimination again. So consultation. This is, again, I cannot wait. So I'm going to stop right here for a second and just say, I'm showing you some of the negative components. We're going to end with some of the positive ones that are out there. So don't think this is all doom and gloom stuff. There are some positive pieces that we're getting correct. And I just want to show these because these are some of the efforts that we're trying to highlight and work on currently. So there are consultation efforts here in Minnesota. These are government to government action. These are part of our decision making at the decision making stage, and any of the matters that have tribal consult or tribal implication. And again, you can see by not engaging in consultation, the highlighted one is the one that I'm raising up today because Native American disparities continue to grow. And all of this, how does this connect to political status? It's looking at us as, again, through the racial lens, rather than looking at us as Native American citizens from a Native American nation. So instead of taking the one step broad stroke approach, which we do now, here in Minnesota, we're taking it in a different direction. So I'm very proud again of us. Here's representation, much of the same. Discrimination, I put workplace up there because I want to, this is really a big subject. When I learned how bad and pervasive the workplace discrimination and harassment is for Native American people, this was released in a Harvard report titled Native American Discrimination in America. And this one blew my mind because it was more than 1 in 3. And so it's a really gross number. Discrimination has many facets and many horrible outcomes to both your health, your mental health, your physical health, the way you just conduct business, and just live. It has a really bad impacts, and it has bad impacts that can ripple out and affect those around you. So this is one of the disparity reports that we're working on right now. We're building partnerships with 2 academic institutions to rewrite the report. The report was originally written by Harvard School of Public Health, and they are looking to do an updated version, working with us on this effort. So more to come on that one, but I just wanted to put that out there as one of the big facets that come out of not using political status. So the good stuff now. Some of the highlights, representation matters. You know, I know Dr. Wilkie is like one of the biggest advocates in this area, but you know what? Here in Minnesota, we're really lucky because many of us are advocates for this. And we recognize that, you know, without representation in the way that we need to be represented, we're going to have all these bad impacts. So we here at the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council are one of the first liaisons to really advocate for some of these bigger efforts. So I'm very proud of where I work because we're pioneering some of those pieces as well. Minnesota as a pioneer, I'll go into what that means because it is really amazing. Here in Minnesota, we codified the government-to-government relations and tribal state relations training requirement for state agencies and for state employees. So representation, these are 3 amazing Native American women. Justice McCaig, my mentor, was the very first Native American justice to sit on a state Supreme Court. Proud of her work every day. She is really spearheading the effort in ICWA, and just many other things. So she's one of my heroes. Peggy, Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, is pioneering every day that she walks into a room or even sits in a space. In 4 days, she might be our new governor, the first Native American governor, woman governor in our union. So she is, again, just an inspiration to our community. And then Senator Kunish, who is also from Standing Rock Sioux Nation, is the only Native American senator in our state legislature. So, and I'm going to stop right there for Senator Kunish because she is, the work she does, the places and the spaces she holds, I don't know how she does it because she is everywhere all at once. And so I'm very proud of her. Anytime she needs anything, I'm there for her, and she knows that. So these are what representation when looking at tribal nations looks like. For us at the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council, our board consists of 10 of the 11 tribes, and these are the pictures of all the tribal leaders. We're a unique agency because we're guided by tribal leadership. So we're the, I like to look at it as a a scale that balances the interest of tribal nations within Minnesota and how the efforts and interest of state. And we try to make sure that that always balances out. It doesn't all the time, obviously. But we do our best to make sure that we're paving the ground for both sides and keeping this relationship amicable and beneficial. So there's 10 here, well, there's 9 here. Actually, there's 9 here. That we're missing 1. But usually we have 10 people on our board. There's 11 tribal nations. One of the tribal nation leaders from the Upper Sioux, Chairman Jensvold, is exercising his sovereign right to not participate. So it doesn't mean he loses those seats. It just means we're holding the chair till he's ready. He will always have a space. He will always be informed, and we will send him everything we do. So he is still part of that. We are statutorily driven to make sure he is still included, even if he chooses not to be. So the pioneer piece. I talked about codification of the government-to-government relationship. This is Minnesota Statute 10.65, which really has all these amazing initiatives, but first and foremost, it requires consultation, state agency consultation with tribal nations on a yearly basis. It's really what's driving the work here in Minnesota. I included the missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. Senator Kunish is the one that started this effort, and it has caught fire across the nation. I mean, we have license plates now with it. So it's just, the work was so necessary, sadly, and she recognized that. And now we have efforts to help protect our Indigenous relatives from being stolen, sex trafficked, everything. So that is amazing work right there. Land back initiatives, again, really holding the treaty provisions to the fire and saying you agreed, you need to do. And so that is a lot of that effort behind land back initiatives here in Minnesota. I put the Great Seal of Minnesota up here. As you can see on the seal, it's Minnesota Makoche, which is a Dakota word. Minnesota itself is a Dakota word. But this is how that representation looks in practice. So it's a good time to be Minnesotan when you're Native American. Under the codification, we have requiring state agency employees to attend tribal state relations training. The big one, inserting tribal liaisons in all 27 of our state agencies. And then, of course, waiving college tuition for Native American students was another great effort because we know that education changes trajectory. There's one thing missing here. I forgot to put it in. We have the very first Native American regent in our University of Minnesota systems, which is Tad Johnson. And he's a Native American from Bois Fort. And again, it's that kind of representation that really drives forth some of our efforts. Padama, yeah. Dr. Wilkie, I can take some questions.